The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, besought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people stupid enough to believe him. Was the true founder of a civil society. From how many wars, crimes, and murders, from how many misfortunes and horrors, might not anyone have saved all mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to its fellows, "Beware of this impostor. You were undone if you won't forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody."
Thus, Jean-Jacques Rousseau described the origin of property rights as an unmitigated tragedy. However, Rousseau was far from the opinion that property rights should be abandoned. Whether or not they were a tragedy, they still remain, in Rousseau's view, the foundational principle of civil society, which should be ultimately respected to one extent or another, but it is up to the sovereign to determine exactly how property should be arranged. When Rousseau spoke of the sovereign, he was not, of course, speaking of a supreme ruler in a literal sense. Instead, he was analogizing the people as a singular collective being, the sovereign, with a unified general will. And where can a people be as rationally conceived as a sovereign being with a general will than when they compose a singular nation, a common people with a common language, culture, religion, history, and/or heritage? Thus, nationalism, the idea that the nation should be congruent with the state or government and sovereign over it, the resulting nation state, and the concept of the natural right of a nation to be sovereign over the land upon which it dwelled, were all born of eccentric French philosophy. In my view, we ought to regard the emergence of the nation state and its right of sovereignty over land in the same way that Rousseau regards property generally. That is, the emergence of nationalism was a tragedy which undoubtedly fueled the fires which have engulfed the world for the better part of the last 2 centuries. But national sovereignty is also the cornerstone of the international order and its international laws, which, though unfortunately weak, represent the most successful effort and the best chance we have to ensure peace in this brave new world of ours. Just as with individual property, however, we must not simply surrender to traditional notions of what state encompasses which land. We must feel free to consider national sovereignty and define its limits, for the nation state is not natural, but is rather a construct conceived by the society in which we live. So let's examine a few ways that people use to define national sovereignty and its limits. That is, what determines which state should control which land, assess their consequences, and explore how they can be applied to actual situations.
The first way that people define national sovereignty is via a tool, the utilization of which, for the purposes of establishing property rights, far predates nationalism. That is, historical sovereignty. A feudal lord can argue that his ancestors owned a plot of land. So, by right, it should be his, and therefore he might make war to reclaim it. This was ultimately how many wars were justified in the Middle Ages, and it continues well into today, where we have an impudent noble, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, earnestly arguing that because Tsar Peter ruled Ukraine, he has a right to do the same. To me, this argument for national sovereignty based on historical sovereignty seems patently absurd, but that doesn't stop it from being an argument, which many, even supposedly enlightened Westerners, very often fall into. So even though I may be content to lay the concept bare, allowing the viewer to stare up its revolting asshole, it is certainly worth explaining why, despite our instincts, historical sovereignty is a horrible way to establish national sovereignty. The primary issue with relying on historical sovereignty over and above the simple absurdity of it is that it doesn't actually solve the conflict, but rather just causes continual fighting. This is because history, though it is based on an objective truth of what happened, is influenced by subjective reality to such an extent that it can produce no agreement. For instance, a Greek may argue that Istanbul, which is actually Constantinople, is Greece because it was founded by a Greek, Constantine, and the area had been inhabited by Greeks for thousands of years. A Turk, even if he agreed on the claims of historical fact, which he very well may not, is likely to respond that it doesn't matter what occurred so long ago. because the Turks have controlled Istanbul for the better part of 600 years. This brings up the question, how do claims in the far-flung past shape up against contemporary claims? The Greeks may well have a much longer history ruling over the area comprising modern Istanbul, but the Turks have ruled it for most of modern history. If the Greeks had the Turks beat by a factor of 5, having ruled that area for 3,000 years, would they gain a right over it? What about a factor of 10, 6,000 years, or impossibly of 100, 60,000 years? To apply this to a contemporary conflict, Crimea was formally annexed into the Russian Empire in 1783. Roughly 170 years after Russia claimed sovereignty over the peninsula, they transferred it to the Ukrainian SSR in 1954. For 60 years, Ukraine had sovereignty over Crimea, but some little green men took it for Russia in 2014, before returning to their bang bus. If you, an idiot like Hassan, will try to argue that Russia has a better claim to Crimea than Ukraine, you should definitely support a Greek invasion of Turkey to retake Constantinople, as the Greeks had ruled the land of Constantinople roughly 2,100 years before it was captured by the Turks in 1453. So the ratio of historical Greek rule to modern Turkish rule of Istanbul, 3.5 to 1, is far greater than that of formal historical Russian rule to modern Ukrainian rule of Crimea, 2.8 to 1. Again, I find the argument of historical sovereignty absurd and non-applicable, so I am taking it to its logical conclusion to show how utterly stupid it really is. Just as Istanbul obviously isn't Greece, Crimea obviously isn't Russia. If you think that these situations are somehow different, I encourage you to consider why. Otherwise, let's just agree on the utter stupidity of the argument of historical sovereignty and move on.
When comparing the situation in Crimea to that of Istanbul, you are likely to point to one major difference which hits at the core of nationalism: ethnicity. Nationalism, after all, dictates that the nation and state be congruent, and ethno-nationalism dictates that the nation is one and the same with ethnicity. In other words, Germans should live in Germany, and Russians should live in Russia, and any incongruence of nation and state must be corrected, whether by conquest, ethnic cleansing, or return to one's homeland. This would explain why we may be more comfortable with the Russian state illegally Slav squatting in Crimea, which has had a solid ethnic Russian majority since the Soviet ethnic cleansing of the peninsula in 1944, compared with them taking the ethnically Ukrainian Kiev, in which Russia actually has a much longer history of imperialism. Although this appeals to the heart to an even greater extent than the justification of historical sovereignty, it also strikes me as nonsensical. The stupidity of ethno-nationalism comes down to two factors: its nonsensical notion of objective nationhood and the horrific incentives it produces. Firstly, ethnicity is neither objective nor an indication of any real unified political will. Ethnicity is an identity, and as we've hopefully learned in the West, identity, rather than being an objective fact, is really just what you call yourself. Is there some special essence within me that makes me an American, a white man, or an idiot? No, I was simply born within what we call the United States of America, being both of the male sex of the so-called white race and of an incredible mental deficiency roughly 22 years ago. Therefore, people naturally refer to me as a stupid white American man, and I've never felt any reason not to be that. Still, you cannot take the opinion of any other stupid white American man, such as Matt Walsh, and substitute it for my own, because although we have certain key similarities, country of birth, race, assigned gender, and mental deficiency, we are undoubtedly unique individuals with unique views on the world. Just as with ethnicity, these factors aligning will certainly increase the likelihood that we will agree on politics and philosophy. But correlation is neither causation nor proof of essence. Therefore, ethno-nationalism is fundamentally mistaken in its assumption that a common identity, ethnicity, indicates a common will. Secondly, ethno-nationalism, if accepted despite its absurdity, produces horrific incentives because each state, in order to maintain control of its land, is implicitly encouraged to cleanse it of any ethnicity but its own. Thus we have the Armenian genocide of Turkey during World War I, the ethnic cleansings of Greece and Turkey which ended their conflict after World War I, and the numerous genocides which took place even after the Nazis were driven out of Eastern Europe in World War II, such as the genocide of the Crimean Tatars. Truly, Eastern Europe thrice was exchanged between one genocidal mustache man and another.
Nah, in order to show how absurd ethno-nationalism is, why not explore another application? I am a red-blooded American patriot. And although most Canadians would certainly disagree, I know without doubt that them Canucks is just a bunch of little Americans. Now, I'm sure that you're thinking at home, Medicatorn, you goddamned hillbilly idiot. Maybe them Anglo-Canadians be like Americans, but what about them Frenchies up in Quebec? I'd respond them Frenchies simply isn't even deeper now than them Anglo-Canadians about their American essence. Besides, no ethnicity is dominant everywhere naturally. There are plenty of areas in, say, Crimea, which are majority Ukrainian, after all. However, I'm not a psychopathic ethno-nationalist like Putin, so I won't drive my bang myself to Kanukistan to rape Jordan Basketball Peterson until he admits that he's a secret American, because that'd make me crazier than a raccoon on Adderall.
Thinking about the example of Canada, you're likely to counter that although objective ethnicity, race, religion, language, etc., can't justly define a nation, something else can. Self-determination. That is, the boundaries of the nation and thus of the nation state are determined by the will of the people. If the Canadians wanted to be Americans, they could vote for it and thus be absorbed into our sovereignty, but they never have and probably never will. So they should remain their own free and sovereign people. This is civic nationalism, the idea that a nation, a community, is defined by consent, that a people should be absorbed into a nation if and when it desires to do so. To me, this civic nationalism seems like the best, most just form of nationalism there is, but it is still not without its flaws. These flaws come from the issues with divining a region's permanent general will based on elections, the existence of minority views, and the malign incentives which, like ethno-nationalism, it produces. I hope that the issues of even fair and free elections dictating permanent policy will be obvious to those living in Western democracies. We so often make choices as a people that we, on some level, regret. And even if you are truly satisfied with, say, our sovereign decision to elect President Obama in 2008, you'd doubtless not like it if he served a second term or for life without ever returning to the electorate for re-election, the consent of the governed. For the same reason, referendums to join, leave, or form a nation are necessarily controversial, because they're decisions made in the moment which have such long-term impacts. Thus, roughly 54% of the Crimean vote favored leaving the USSR, and therefore joining an independent Ukraine in their independence referendum of 1991, by far the smallest margin of any oblast, the rough Ukrainian equivalent of a state or province. This was a relatively slim margin, but it still comprised a majority, so Crimea justly became an autonomous part of the Ukrainian nation-state, newly released from the tight, revolting embrace of Mother Russia. Subsequently, Crimea voted with solid majorities for further increased autonomy from Ukraine, but these sweeping changes to the republic's constitution were rejected in Kiev. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, under the watchful eye of the incumbent opposition and international observers, was elected Ukraine's president by a narrow plurality of about 49%. However, this Yanukovych soon showed himself to be in flagrant opposition to the general will for further European integration due to the unfortunate reality that he is one of Putin's gimps. Therefore, the Ukrainian people gathered in protest in Kiev against his refusal to commit to the EU, and Yanukovych further inflamed the protest with his deadly draconian crackdown upon it. Therefore, Yanukovych fled Kiev to be with Daddy Putin and Mommy Medvedev in Russia, so the Ukrainian parliament formally kicked him out of office and reconstituted the government. In the midst of this chaos, Vladimir Putin sent his green little good old boys to seize Crimea, and they held a referendum on annexation shortly thereafter, carrying the day with roughly 97% of the vote counted in favor of annexation. Obviously, this referendum was not a legitimate reflection of the people's will. The difference between the 1991 referendum, a majority of 8% in favor of joining an independent Ukraine, And this 2014 referendum, a majority of 94% in favor of joining Russia, should demonstrate that clearly enough. But there are also the realities that the voters were offered a false choice. Return to the 1992 Constitution, which Kiev had rejected, or join Russia. The referendum was widely boycotted by minority groups like the Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians. Putin's regime is notorious for its manipulation of domestic elections. And this all took place while voters sat before the barrels of Putin's good old boys who were actively occupying the peninsula. The reason why I outline this scenario is that it shows the complexity of deriving the permanent general will of the sovereign by election. Putin and Yanukovych argue that the revolution of dignity, which I just described, was really a violent, unjust coup d'etat, because it contradicts the result of the presidential elections from 4 years previously. However, they chose to flagrantly violate the sovereignty and laws of Ukraine, Crimea, and the settled international order when they seized Crimea for Russia. Ukraine would argue that obviously their general will was never to be ruled from Putin's bang bus in Russia, as would be expressed later in a 2014 presidential election. And Crimea had already joined Ukraine's independent sovereignty in 1991. You see, even if you define the proper determinant of sovereignty as self-determination, you can easily disagree how and when it is expressed. For instance, did Ukraine properly determine its own fate in 2010 or 2014? Did Crimea do so in 1991 or 2014? The answers to these questions seem clear to me, but a group relying on self-determination alone is still bound to disagree. In addition, there are bound to be minority groups who disagree with the majority, even if that majority decision is valid. If Anglo-Canadians freely voted to join America, would French Canadians be bound to follow? If the ethnically Russian majority in Crimea legitimately wanted to join Russia, what of the ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars? We saw the flaws of self-determination when we tried to implement it in the peace process after World War I. Italian nationalists could cry and shit and come about all the ethnic Italians swept up into Yugoslavia by South Slavic majorities, and German nationalists could do the same about the ethnic Germans swept up into Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, and France. This implementation of self-determination then ultimately created nationalist grievances which produced the rise of fascism and culminated in World War II. In addition, even though, as stated previously, ethnicity is just an identity, it is also correlated with voting patterns, just as any identity. Therefore, as the sovereign of any state, if I don't want my lands to join, whether by vote or otherwise, a neighboring nation state, I'm heavily incentivized to ethnically cleanse it. Thus, after the Nazis unleashed terror on Eastern Europe in World War II, initially justifying it based upon and being supported throughout by local ethnic Germans, Eastern European countries expelled and in some cases resettled their ethnically German populations en masse. To be clear, I'm certainly not arguing that this collective punishment was morally just or even in retrospect practically expedient, but it's fair to say that these nation states, correctly or not, were acting for their own perceived interests of self-preservation, which were created by the trauma of self-determination and ethno-nationalism working in concert. So what alternative is there? If we can agree that historical sovereignty, ethno-nationalism, and self-determination are ultimately flawed ways to tell national sovereignty, which can produce no agreement and thus settle no conflicts, how can we do so? Are we left to choose between long-lasting peace and the continuation of the nation-state?
I would argue not. As I noted previously, national sovereignty is the cornerstone of the international order, and we have established a clear, conflict-free way of establishing national sovereignty, international law. I don't mean to suggest that international law is simple, objective, or even always correct. But if we can all agree to abide by one authority, such as the UN, we can create a world without the constant horror of nationalist bloodshed, war, genocide, and terror. According to international law, what is Crimea? Ukrainian, what is Istanbul? Turkish, what is Tel Aviv? Israeli, what is the West Bank? Palestinian. In my view, international law on national sovereignty can be analogized to individual property law. That is, it's complex, its bases and justifications are varied, and there are several organs of government which impose rules on it. However, if I own a house, somebody may approach me with various legally compelling arguments about why actually it's their property. This encounter doesn't need to end in bloodshed because he and his lawyer can present his arguments to the authorities, and my lawyer and I can attempt to refute them and show them the deed of ownership. Probably neither of us understands property laws or how to navigate the system, But that's what lawyers are for, so we can resolve our conflict peacefully. And this is ultimately how we should approach international law. National sovereignty is complex and its rules are nuanced, but all of us don't need to understand it fully. We just need to allow each nation to take their grievances to the international authorities, consult with the international community, and submit to the final decision of international law. When any nation fails to do this and attempts to enforce their will with violence, they must be met with equal violence so as to enforce the sanctity of international law. In this sense, there is a greater sovereignty to be considered, the sovereignty of the international community with its general will to ensure peace and order. If one, like Hassan and the rest of Putin's gimps, chooses to argue that there's actually a super special right underlying violations of international law, let's agree that they're perpetuating nationalist grievance, bloodshed, and war, and are thus a morally repugnant piece of shit who should really choke on cock and die.
If you wish to know more about the society in which you live and why coffee has made it so, watch this video next. Godspeed, gamers.